Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining slowly. We are recording this meeting, so if you have any concern, you can email Bram, who is here. Slowly joining. So Jenna and Kate, are you? Where are you now exactly?
Jen, I'll let you start because you're on the beach.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm in Australia in New South Wales, so southeast coast. And yes, I am very close to the beach for my writing process of my dissertation.
I'm holding down the fort back in Canberra at the ANU.
Ah, well, nice. I asked because I wasn't sure of the difference of the time, and that's why I asked.
No, we really appreciate the time. Actually, this is perfect. 5:30 is great for us.
Okay, that's great. Glad to hear. Okay, yes, we have a lot of people joining. Bram, whenever you want, I can start, but I'm gonna wait one more minute. Okay, yeah, I'll give some more minutes, and everyone has their mics muted, which is great. Okay. So at 9:35. I hope someday we can go back to have some hybrid seminars at BUV at least. I'm here alone. Guys, we have about 14, 15 people joining. That's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's really a pleasure. It's the first time that I'm chairing these meetings, so I hope Ram doesn't kill me. I think I am gonna start slowly introducing these two researchers. So Jenna Harb and Professor Catherine Kate Hem, they both work at RegNet, the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance. I said it right. Jenna is a PhD candidate and member of the Justice and Technoscience Lab. And she works in surveillance, policing technologies, anti-sexual violence, and data protection as well. And today, well, they both are going to focus on welfare and surveillance and regulation, which is their topic. And Jenna, in her PhD, she focused on cash-based assistance and emergency response to the Beirut port explosion that they are gonna talk a little bit about today if you have read the summary of today's presentation. And Jenna's dissertation basically examines how social assistance and humanitarian systems in Lebanon adapt to this ongoing crisis. And she bases on science and technology studies, and also regulatory governance and transnational feminist theories. And I have the pleasure also to introduce Kate. Professor Kate is the director of RecNet, like I mentioned, the Australian National University. And is also an adjunct professor at Arizona State University. And her research also touches upon the concept of inequality, technoscience, and regulation. And she as well has published widely on biometric surveillance, criminology, and human enhancement and well-being, as well as technologies of policing. And she also was previously, she held the Canada Research Chair in Biogovernance at the University of Waterloo. And so today, they will both present on this digital welfare state, where the main focus is how big tech and private actors have increased influence on social assistance, delivery, growing surveillance, and the self-regulation. So they are gonna have a look at it critically. And they will present an analysis of emergency and humanitarian response, like I mentioned, what the PhD student Jenna is working on the Beirut port explosion, and they are gonna focus on. I will stop here because then I'm just going to introduce your topic, and I'm sure, you're experts, and I'm really glad that you're both here. So I will stop and I will give the floor to Jenna and Kate. Thank you so much for being here once again from Australia and with the time difference. The floor is yours.
No, thank you so much for that kind introduction. You could have kept going. It's better than perhaps how I would introduce myself, so I appreciate it. We're really delighted to be here, especially because we couldn't attend the Surveillance Studies Network conference, and it would have been lovely to see many of you in person. So this is fantastic. You could accommodate the time difference. We really appreciate it because we're really craving engagement with colleagues in the field and are really looking forward to your feedback. That said, I'll share my slides, but before I do, I just want to acknowledge that Jenna and I are coming from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, which are the traditional custodians of the unceded lands where we're meeting you, and we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to any First Nations colleagues who might join the call today. So here I'll share my slides. Apologize in advance if I'm a little slow. All right, we should be good there. Please yell at me if you can't see it. So our talk today explores the rise of what's been called the digital welfare state, which is perhaps best understood as a catch-all term for a really wide range of digitized processes that are employed in the provision of social protection across many parts of the world. And so to put that a little bit more concretely, our focus today is on services and resources intended to ensure minimum standards of health, well-being, economic security for individuals and groups, which can include things like social security or monetary assistance, as well as enabling access to education, employment, healthcare, and housing. So a really wide range of things that have become digitized. And while we often see these as obligations for governments to provide as part of the expectations of the welfare state, these forms of digitization, many of which include surveillance practices, extend well beyond so-called liberal or highly industrialized economies. They include humanitarian and aid activities, which we'll talk about today, and that can span conflict zones, lower income countries, emergency affected and resource depleted areas. So just to give a little bit more context in terms of what that catch-all phrase captures. So the digital welfare state, while we're using this term in part because it's gained traction in recent years, and in part because we hope to problematize some of the narratives that surround it. A key example is the notable 2019 report by Professor Philip Alston, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, which criticized the growing reliance on automation and digital technologies to deliver social welfare. Alston warns that the rise of this digital welfare state globally had resulted in what he referred to as a human rights-free zone, which had invited big tech and other private actors to influence social assistance in ways that were increasing their surveillance capacity, eroding privacy, particularly for precarious peoples, and serving their corporate interests. So he was very clear in this report that relying on these actors to self-regulate, meaning check themselves, meant that there were few mechanisms in place to prevent or curtail exploitative actions or to protect social assistance recipients from harm. So in short, he really warned, and he says this pretty explicitly, this space is becoming etched and shaped by surveillance capitalism, and other scholars have since traced this empirically in China, Denmark, India, as well as others, but those are probably the three kind of landmark areas that are being studied, as well as India, but to a lesser extent in relation to surveillance capitalism. So of course, even before Alston's report, advocates and researchers were engaging with these questions and concerns. Such work has really proliferated, though, in recent years, with much of it showcasing how digitized aid and social assistance not only reflect extractive business values and practices, but also colonial logics. So recognizing the value and diversity of the work that's been done to date, our talk today kind of aims to support these continued efforts, but also to step back and complicate some of their claims with the hope of opening other avenues for inquiry. So in saying that, I should note, since this is an audience that's really familiar with the interdisciplinary literature on surveillance, what we'll do in this talk is we'll tend to highlight insights from other fields as a way of sharing other ideas and resources to support others in exploring these and related dynamics. So just a brief overview in terms of the format for the rest of the presentation. Jenna and I are basically going to split speaking duties. So first we'll discuss some of the overarching narratives, as I've done here, and then we'll move on to some of our empirical work. I'll give an overview of that broader research agenda that we've been doing at ANU, and then I'll turn it over to Jenna to provide a more detailed account of findings from the ethnographic research on Lebanon that she's been doing since 2019. She'll cover some of the tensions that emerge on the ground between competing humanitarian agendas, in particular how the infrastructure and embedded surveillance practices of aid come to undermine efforts to localize. And by localize, I mean, this is a particular language used on the ground as a response that aims to support broader efforts to quote unquote decolonize humanitarian practices. And I'll let her discuss that a little bit more, but just to give you a flavor of what she'll discuss. We'll then conclude by reflecting on these observations and how they suggest a more complicated picture of the digital welfare state than what typically emerges in many common narratives, such as the UN report. And the power asymmetries in this case, I just want to say up front, are not simply private sector driven, and I'm sure many in the audience have done work in this space and recognize that. And rather, we really want to highlight how they're fashioned through entanglements of humanitarian systems, digitized processes, business rationalities, and actors that need to actually strategically navigate these conjoined demands. So let's jump to the digital welfare state as we think we know it. And as we think we know it is kind of a nod to some feminist geographers, Julie Graham and Katherine Gibson, who used to write under the pen name J.K. Gibson Graham. And their work is really a sustained reminder that capitalism And developments, attributed to capitalism, for example, surveillance capitalism as it pertains to our case, is not just a tightly formed system with clear deterministic logics or effects. Instead, they really encourage a feminist unpacking of extractive practices, as well as the rhetorical devices we use to explain capitalism in ways that are not centered or clustered around market activities alone. So they really want to encourage others to push beyond the traditional confines and conventions of political economy, and that's something we find particularly productive in our work. So some concerns regarding the digital welfare state that often appeal to these overarching narratives that Gibson Graham interrogate. While we're saying something critical about them, I don't want to suggest that they're not important. And so just to highlight a couple of those, people have been done excellent work highlighting the impacts on eligibility assessment, ID verification, benefit calculation and payment for recipients, and how surveillance mechanisms and digitized processes are supposed to make these more efficient, but can actually prevent them from accessing them. And so again, they really highlight this appeal to efficiency might actually undermine the quality of services and the ability to access them. So it's not just about privacy, it's also about ensuring people get resources as well. In addition to these concerns, scholars have highlighted how these practices often amount to use some terms, digital poorhouses, that actually, people aren't physically confined, but they're constrained by the digital processes themselves and can't maneuver or enact freely in ways they might have otherwise, as well as a form of quote unquote non-human humanitarianism, as well as various forms of colonialism. So these depictions vary, some of which are data colonialism, digital colonialism, and techno-colonialism. And that's all work, if you want to check it out further, we've added the authors. But for this presentation, we've decided to park these terms as analytic lenses. We're not going to use them actually, though I do want to acknowledge their value. Instead, we're going to look at things more closely through a more situated approach informed by feminist technoscience and feminist transnational studies. What does that mean? More simply put, is we want to actually try to get closer to what's happening on the ground, and really trying to refine what feminist scholars call feminist objectivity. So rather than looking up and trying to get a broad picture, which a lot of the forms of empiricism suggest, we want to get closer to be more objective, recognizing that knowledge in its generation is partial. So in other words, the closer we get, we can glean insights from the actors navigating these conditions and better understand and explain them. So this aligns with a lot of what surveillance study scholars have long recommended, even though they don't often or always use feminist or intersectional language. And so we just wanted to highlight a couple synergies here as they apply to the digital welfare state. And so, as those of us who study surveillance, we're very much aware about cautioning against subscribing to deterministic narratives, advocating for more nuance and understanding how surveillance operates, to query the taken for granted technosocial relations and infrastructures, which, as Hein and other digital sociologists remind us, they're often designed not to be noticed. So we really want to pull them apart and see them up close. And then also to consider how surveillance can capture productive and nuanced forms of power, agency, and resistance. And some of Jenna's discussion will capture that, even though we're looking at a space with notable power asymmetries. So our approach and the kind of collaborations that this work comes from, and then I'll turn it over to Jenna. So this project commenced in 2018 as a multi-sited ethnography that we set up when I was a Canada Research Chair at University of Waterloo. And that's kind of grown and expanded and changed thanks to the pandemics, and actually in some productive ways. So our driving question was, how does this notion of the digital welfare state manifest in everyday life, and what does it actually look like across different spaces? And it started as a collaborative research team where I was doing field work in India and Australia, Jenna was doing work in Lebanon, others were doing work in other spaces. And because of the pandemic, we've had to adapt our approach. And we've actually moved to creating an edited volume with a much wider range of cases and collaborators. And so while we aren't highlighting their work today, I do want to acknowledge that we've been in conversation with them over a series of workshops, and they've inevitably informed our thinking. And those sites, just to give you a sample, are in Brazil, China, Ghana, India, Kenya, Jenna's work on Lebanon, Pakistan, and then also on UN systems, for example, around migration and the BIM system. So that's just to give you a sampling of what we've been working on. But again, to really get a sense of what that looks like, we're going to do a deep dive into Jenna's work, and I'll turn it over to her next.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kate. And thank you all for having us here today. Kate, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please.
Yep.
Lovely. So today we're going to be using evidence from my fieldwork, interviews, and document analysis to isolate a set of tensions that play out. While welfare technologies fuel entanglements of financialization, privatization, and business rationalities, they also undermine donor and practitioner endeavors to localize aid, which are part of broader calls to decolonize humanitarianism. I'll explain 3 cases to make this argument, revealing surveillance practices that are embedded in localization efforts. The first is crowdsourced mapping of small businesses for emergency grants. The second is automated vulnerability targeting, and the third is digital banking cards. Next slide, please. So I'll start off by providing a bit of context about Lebanon's transnational digital welfare state. The World Bank describes Lebanon's contemporary context as possibly one of the top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century. Overlapping crises, including the almost total collapse of the electricity system, unprecedented hyperinflation, and a revolving door of corrupt and caretaker governments, have exacerbated shortages of most essential goods, such as fuel, and they've turned basic items like flour into costly luxury goods. In August 2020, the nation also experienced one of the largest non-nuclear blasts in history, which is often referred to as the Beirut Blast, and this further increased welfare needs in the nation. According to the UN, now 82% of Lebanon's population lives in multidimensional poverty, with rates even higher amongst the refugee populations, and these are the largest per capita in the world. Despite the vast need for social assistance, Lebanon is actually one of the only nations in the world in which the state does not provide minimum social services for its citizens. So as a result, there's nothing but gaps in welfare provision. A highly transnational network of non-state actors consequently fill the vacuum left by the state. This includes NGOs and INGOs, religious groups, community groups, private sector experts, and international governance institutions such as the UN. Overlapping crises have invited a range of technologies and techniques associated with digital welfare that perhaps were not used at the same level or scale as they were before these crises really manifested in 2019. So we want to understand how these digitized tools are operating here. Next slide, please. Perfect. So now I'll move on to my empirical examples that reveal how welfare technologies have a lot of trouble working alongside localization. So in response to the Beirut blast, an INGO that I interviewed talked about how they offered access to credit and cash for affected small businesses. They crowdsourced data from a network of volunteers so that they could quickly assess who was damaged and thus decide who they should give the grants to. Their labor involved crowdsourcing emergency. The labor involved in crowdsourcing emergency payments was both privatized and localized. So in this case, what we see is that Google offered a digital platform that enabled working with partners who were located all around the world. And civil society groups, or CSOs, were recruited because locals best understand the conditions of Lebanese businesses, and locals are also well connected with diaspora groups. What became apparent was that CSOs were perceived as taking on important characteristics of the private sector, and that they were highly efficient and self or under-regulated. They're incredibly mobile, have people ready on the ground to collect data, and are not subject to time-intensive bureaucratic procedures that larger institutions entail. So locals are thus well positioned to act well before notoriously slow UN and INGO systems, which is, of course, highly valued in emergencies because needs must be addressed immediately. For these reasons, civil society were tasked with collecting and cataloging crisis data. They took pictures of damaged property and equipment and logged key information about local businesses, which they then uploaded in the Google managed system. Next slide, please. So CSOs collected information on more than 3,000 small businesses, but in comparison, the INGO was very slow in rolling out their small business damage assessments. It took them weeks to assess and reach 1,300 businesses, which was less than half of what the CSOs were able to accomplish. This is largely because they mandated that people sign a consent form outlining how their data will be collected and used. And of course, these are important, but also very burdensome and lengthy rituals of regulation that make data collection much more time consuming. When the INGO asked the CSOs if they had the express consent of businesses to use the information that they collected, they all said no. As a result, the INGO was prevented from using the immense volumes of locally collected information in their vulnerability assessments. The INGO said, quote, "It's both heartbreaking because it comes from good intentions, but it's not compliant with minimum standards, so the INGO could not engage. It's a partnership that is dying even though it should flourish." So here we see a tension and also ironic contradiction between business logics and digitized welfare operations and localization. Civil society are valued for their similarity to the private sector, but at the same time, they're also penalized and excluded for being too much like businesses and that they were self or under-regulated. And they did this in ways that do not meet transnational organization standards. Practitioners would say things like, oh, locals just require more training or they require more capacity building so that they could align their data protection protocols with the INGO's requirements and procedures. But as several of my participants noted, many donors are actually very reluctant to pay to build the capacity of local organizations. What they often articulated was that donors just give funding and data access to transnational organizations because they already have standing relationships and agreements with these more prominent groups. Next slide, please. So our second empirical case focuses on automated targeting. UN agencies employ proxy means testing, which essentially means that personal data on refugees is plugged into a formula that then predicts and ranks poverty scores. In doing so, they can target cash assistance to the most in need. The algorithm is framed by the UN as better for their bottom line because it's much more efficient than past processes where they had to personally visit all refugee households in order to assess eligibility. This took immense time and labor and was simply not cost effective. The algorithm also supports fraud prevention, which is a rationality that is prominent in the business sector, especially in fintech. It's framed as reliably evaluating vulnerability levels because it relies on seemingly objective statistical data and computerized analysis that can't be falsified or subject to human bias. The data that's processed by the formula is collected by field staff, many of whom are Lebanese residents and are employed by the UN or INGOs. These local actors register demographic and biographic data on refugees in validation centers on a quarterly basis. What we've found is that this idea of fraud prevention really thwarts accountability, transparency, and consultation with affected populations, which of course contradicts the localization agenda. The UN rationalizes keeping the vulnerability criteria secret by claiming that if beneficiaries know what the vulnerability criteria are, they will game the system or they will fraudulently apply for aid when they're not actually in need of it. And this parallels ideas of welfare fraud or the welfare queen trope that we often see in North America. Next slide, please. In another way, field staff expressed frustration that information about the proxy means testing was not divulged to them. Field staff weren't given information about how targeting works, what criteria it uses to make assessments, or its error rates. As such, they couldn't explain the algorithm to refugees who ask about it, nor could they adequately address complaints about being wrongfully excluded from assistance. And such opacity has fueled distrust and anger, making both local practitioners and refugees think that the formula uses random selection, which of course dampens local confidence in the humanitarian sector. Next slide, please. Further diminishing localization, a report by the high-level panel on humanitarian cash transfers states that, quote, UN agencies have taken decisions on targeting and inclusion in Lebanon unilaterally, with no involvement of other actors in the process and with low possibilities of gaining insight in the process. This exclusion also applies to targeted communities as well. An impact evaluation by the Lebanon Cash Consortium claims that targeted communities had, quote, limited, if any, participation in the decision-making process. The UN has therefore maintained monopolized decision-making power over essentially all aspects of the targeting algorithm, including how transparent the system is to locals and how much input they are given. And this has significant social inequity issues. There is extensive evidence in my own research and in public reports that vulnerable and thus eligible refugees are denied eligibility to social assistance by the targeting algorithm. So there is really this need for a lot more transparency and consultation with local residents, though it's not appearing as much on the ground as it should be. What this example reveals is that despite claims by the humanitarian sector to go local, business rationalities of fraud prevention and cost savings are valued over and above efforts to meaningfully decolonize aid. We know that the humanitarian sector benefits from a unique level of legitimacy, given that it is predicated on charitable work and on principles like humanity and neutrality. So in combination with the opacity of the algorithms, these dynamics fuel the ability of transnational groups to make incontestable decisions about including or excluding locals in digitized welfare. Next slide, please. So I'm now moving on to my third example, which are digital banking cards. As of 2016, UN agencies deliver financial assistance to Syrian refugees using electronic banking cards, or what they call e-cards for short. This enables beneficiaries to choose what they purchase for their household based on their distinct needs, which is of course incredibly valuable. The choice to move away from in-kind food distribution or cash in hand, which was more traditional, is heavily influenced by corporate, neoliberal, and capitalist logics and partnerships. So in the Lebanese case, we see private sector partners like MasterCards offer their expertise in technology and payment systems. Digital banking also boasts efficiency in its ability to deliver large amounts of aid to expansive recipient populations as compared to transporting, storing, and dispersing food or cash. And lastly, banking card purchases are framed as contributing to the local economy, which is incredibly important during their financial crisis. And this logic turns refugee beneficiaries into consumers or clients. And this is actually how the World Food Program refers to them in reference to electronic banking cards. Next slide, please. So even though digital banking is a technological solution to poverty, it still requires in-person surveillance, which tends to receive less attention in academic literature. This surveillance is conducted by Lebanese NGOs in an attempt to more meaningfully partner with them and to tap into their local knowledge and relationships as a resource. ATM monitoring is conducted by local partners like Caritas, who work in Mount Lebanon and in the south of the country, and then they report back to the UNHCR on their efforts. ATM monitoring is incredibly valuable for social assistance that's digitized. It prevents overcrowding, enforces social distancing, and organizes the queue of people lined up at ATMs. This is important for COVID safety measures, but it's also really important in Lebanon because it prevents social tension and violence, or at least attempts to deter it. And social tension and violence are incredibly prominent throughout the country between host communities and refugees, but particularly at banking sites, especially given currency shortages and pervasive anti-refugee sentiment in the nation. ATM monitoring is also valuable given consistent power outages that leave ATMs inactive. NGOs monitoring can report where outages occur and for how long, and if cards were swallowed by ATMs, which is actually quite common in this context, unfortunately. Power outages also turn the machine off mid-transaction. So evidence collected from monitoring is particularly useful given that sometimes refugees are actually questioned on whether they truly received the cash because the payment was not processed in the digital system. However, the system may indicate that the cash was dispersed and therefore they have to be questioned about this. And this is where ATM monitoring comes in as an additional form of evidence. In another way, digital cards also require household visits and interviews. There's something called post-implementation monitoring, in which select households are visited by national NGOs like the Makhzoomi Foundation in the middle or the end of an assistance program. Refugees are interviewed at their homes to ensure that what they described about their job, access to other forms of assistance, their spending patterns, and their living situation are true and consistent with what they told the humanitarian institutions upon registering for aid. So not only do these household visits reduce fraudulent claims, it also enables the UN to learn about how assistance can be improved directly from recipients. Next slide, please. So our research found that digitized social assistance payments end up having a lot of trouble with meaningful localization. It's something that I think is a little bit easier said than done in this context. So monitoring is mandated by digitized interventions, and it's done by local NGOs on behalf of international institutions and donors. However, these local residents and groups are given very peripheral roles. Local participation entails following directives, reporting back to transnational agencies, and labor-intensive responsibilities. But locals don't get decision-making power or funding in return. And locals require permission from donors and the UN for most tasks, with one of the NGOs I spoke to saying, quote, "We don't do anything without having the permission of the partner," in this case referring to the UNHCR. Localization thus functions as value adding, but largely for transnational actors, reaping value from local labor, including surveillance labor, and thus legitimizing discourse that transnational groups are including local partners, even though local inclusion is asymmetrical. Local actors, of course, don't accept this subservient position. They are pushing back. NGOs explicitly ask for more access to resources and information, and they work to actively position themselves in ways that enable participation in decision-making. However, even they recognize that at the end of the day, this capacity is limited because they don't receive the funding, which is pretty much solely given to the UN. So transnational institutions like the UNHCR and WFP remain the major decision makers who dictate how digital banking is designed, programmed, and distributed, including how much local actors are involved. So basically, across these three examples, we see the entanglement of different business and financialized influences in digitized humanitarian aid. And while, of course, very well intended and working in incredibly difficult circumstances, these logics, practices, and partnerships are in tension with localization in ways that are not simply corrupted by transnational corporate actors, which is how much of the literature tends to frame it. They actually reflect hybridized power asymmetries in which local actors are still participating in digital welfare, but they're doing so in ways that are undeniably less powerful. So now I'll pass it back to Kate.
Great, thanks so much, Jenna. There we go. So just some concluding thoughts, and again, we're really looking forward to the conversation and your feedback. So what we wanted to do here is glean some insights from a situated case to kind of dig deeper into some of the entangled relationships that have been acknowledged in the literature in relation to the digital welfare state, but really showcase what additional ethnographic work can add. So we see it kind of highlighting two things for here, highlighting the tensions around pursuing localization on the ground, giving competing logics, and then also illustrating the agency of actors and what some scholars call like forms of mundane governance. And by mundane governance, it's an STS term that's been used for those that aren't really familiar with. It really explores how the embrace of different technologies in everyday life become powerful modes of regulation. I think we can really see that illustrated in Jenna's case. So that, excuse me, let me just take a drink of water. That said, in illustrating the intertwining of business and humanitarian rationalities, and you'll notice they're not all necessarily about markets, right? There are other kinds of logics that permeate some of what Jenna's described. We hope that this paper, this talk's based on, adds some nuance around existing claims around colonial logics operating in and through practices that fall under the umbrella of the digital welfare state. Like others, we recognize there are wider power asymmetries implicating social protection, but there's a need for more work that really excavates how they're taking shape, even as different actors try to resist the colonial dimensions of humanitarian aid. Now, of course, one could argue that localization on its own isn't going to decolonize aid. We completely agree with that observation, but that would probably be another talk in and of itself. So in doing so, what we've tried to do is just highlight the tensions on the ground and to illustrate how surveillance-laden practices in this context and surveillance practices that aren't necessarily digitized, do operate to shore up the exercise of power by transnational actors, but also reveal points of contestation. So we're going to leave you with kind of three broader points about the shifts that are happening that are not always captured in discussions of digital humanitarianism or welfare. And the first is really highlighting the transnational forces that are not always seen as entangled. I mean, Lebanon's an amazing case, and I mean amazing in the sense that it's distinctive in the sense that the domestic state is not as powerful as the transnational actors at play. And those transnational forces can be really evidently observed empirically. And you can see how they sustain matrices of domination that other scholars have highlighted, but in ways that may not be as clearly stated in the ways that we tend to think about intersectional concerns. So we tend to think about, formations of oppression and people standing at axes of oppression. In this case, you can really see how they come at the crossroads of different forces, not necessarily clear axes of discrimination. And this is a critique that queer scholars have actually charged of intersectionality, and Jasbir Puar is probably the most notable person to say we need to rethink how we talk about discrimination and formations of oppression, and I do think this example helps us in doing that. The second is I think it marks a departure from accepted tenets about aid reifying what scholars have often called reifying a neoliberal world order. And that's not to say that those patterns aren't continuing and prevailing, but digitization and financialization are entangled, and not to mention the growth of inequality, which the pandemic has exacerbated. And those, structural shifts are refiguring both states and markets, as well as the relationships between them. And I think Jenna's example kind of illustrates things that depart from kind of the classic neoliberal examples of responsibilization that we've tended to look at in surveillance studies. And third, and I'll conclude with this last point, given some of these dynamics aren't receiving the same levels of scrutiny in relation to, the very important project of documenting digitized shift, we want to suggest that there's another major research agenda on how the rise of the digital welfare state is actually an outgrowth of what some scholars are calling 21st century capitalism. And this is something that a few scholars are working on globally. One of our colleagues, Professor Susan Sell, who's a prominent international political economy scholar, has really advocated and worked on this for some years now, arguing, look, neoliberalism is a powerful cultural and economic form. However, 21st century capitalism has changed. And again, it's not to say that neoliberalism is completely dead, it endures, but we need to be paying more attention to how it has shifted and how it is shifting in everyday life. So we don't have time to go into our work, but I do want to flag it as a way of inviting others to think through these structural global shifts and how they're not only implicating what we've discussed here, but also changing other surveillance landscapes. And if anyone's interested in that paper, I'm happy to share it. It is a 2022 paper, and it's probably pretty easy to find. It is literally 21st century capitalism, a research agenda. So we'll end there. But we'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback.
Well, thank you so much. I think I speak for everyone. It was a really interesting talk, and you raised really, important and important concepts that sometimes, at least I speak for myself, we tend to go more into the corporate business, but there is your topic of the welfare state that really focuses on well, poverty and people that are really struggling. So thank you so much for your talk. It's really important, and I'm sure a lot of people have many questions. They are all with their cameras off. Of course, you don't have to turn it on, but I invite people, if they want, to turn it on and to speak. And if you have any questions for Jenna and Kate, now is the time. I'll let you think about it. But to me, I will start because I see that everyone is very shy. um, so again, thank you so much. I know that at the beginning you started introducing a little bit this concept of feminism and in technoscience and transnational studies. And I wonder if you could perhaps explain a little bit how that influenced also your research, because, to me, this is very important also for my research, but I think now with increased feminist studies, and I think probably you come across a lot of issues when you were doing more practical work, or probably like the interviews perhaps in Lebanon. I imagine that's a big, cultural difference. So perhaps you can explain a little bit more.
Jenna, do you want me to reflect on big picture stuff and then let you talk about some of the embodied things that happen on the ground? Because I think one thing we don't talk about in this form of the research is how gendered it is. Like, you can't get around it. On one hand,
Yeah.
Poverty is clearly a feminized issue, disproportionately affects women and children. That's a global trend. But also the actual process of doing this kind of field work does have different kinds of gendered components and power dimensions with it. So with feminist technoscience, I would say it is a productive inroad in broader discussions of gender and inequality, in the sense that there's lots of different feminisms that can help explain different aspects of the world. But what feminist technoscience has done really, really well is remind us that gendered formations of power don't just operate in and through human bodies, right? There are powerful actors at work, and the corporate actors, this is, you said there's a focus on corporate actors in this group. That's very, very important, and an overlooked space in gender studies that I think feminist technoscience helps us bring in those non-human actors, but also those structural shifts together to think through how gender hierarchies are sustained, but also shifting. And so if anyone's interested in further exploring that literature, I'd be happy to share resources. The one thing I would say, and I think this is a biting critique that's definitely relevant to older camps of feminist technoscience, that it has tended to whitewash some of these dynamics by not attending to racial and ethnic hierarchies that get generated through different forms of capital as well as other formations. And I think a lot of scholars have responded to that. I think that's also the changing nature of the field. I think early feminist scholars tended to focus on STS spaces that were elite, that were white, and so the gendered components may have stuck out more to them. But I'd say that literature is becoming very rich. And in fact, the University of Washington Press has a great series dedicated to feminist technoscience that really shows that range of work. Jenna, I might turn it over to you to reflect a little bit more about just how gendered this project is and how feminist studies informed your approach.
Absolutely. And it's a great question, Anna. Well, yeah, as Kate mentioned, my research, of course, is revealing so many gender dynamics, but I think where feminist technoscience was most important for me was not necessarily its emphasis specifically upon gender, but stepping back a bit and actually looking at how social inequality and power structures operate in and through technology. And of course, gender is but one of those, of course, major components in how social inequality manifests. So what I really see in my case with, let's say we are going to focus on gender as a lens to interrogate social inequality, we see that female-headed households aren't able to as easily go to validation sites to update their biometric and demographic information and confirm their registration, because that would entail bringing all of their children with them or leaving them at home. In the same way, we see that there is tons of reports how women are less educated, so they have less literacy, and they also have less familiarity in using banking technologies that I think some transnational institutions tend to take a bit for granted. And in that case, what happens is not only are they less confident in using ATMs, they're also forgetting their PIN number, which is given to them upon receiving the card. And then this leads to further relationships of exploitation because they require a third party to then go to the banking site and use the card for them. Sometimes they ask for a little bit of money in return, or they keep the card. And in other cases, if a woman is going to a shop to purchase goods with the card, at the end of the day, they receive a receipt that says how much the goods were and how much is the remaining balance that's left on their social assistance card. But this requires trusting the shop staff to tell them what the prices of goods are and what the receipt actually says at the end of the day. And there have been reports and monitoring that I came through in my research that some of my participants indicated that there were, of course, some limited circumstances in which the shop owners weren't truthful about how much is left on their card. And so therefore they would pocket a bit of the money. And of course, they're doing really important regulation and monitoring of these shops to try to dissuade this type of exploitation. But it is something that we take for granted with gender, and that certain populations are going to experience inequities and disadvantages in ways that other groups are not. I could really go on. There's a lot of issues with laborers, for instance, and this doesn't just apply to women, but we know that women do take on a lot of laborer roles, but laborers would go to register their fingerprints, but they're not registering as easily because they're, of course, worn down by the type of work that they're doing. And so we're taking a certain type of human body for granted in the use of data and technology. But yes, feminist technoscience has been absolutely foundational to my research and just always centers the question of power and power dynamics at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. That was a great explanation. And indeed, I was thinking about you mentioned literacy on, unfortunately, the most disadvantage that, again, unfortunately, is probably in these societies, women. And thank you so much for your explanation. It was very clear and really interesting. I see that you've shared some articles, Kate, that they ask you on the chat. If you can share some more, and if you need their email address, you can email Bram, or I think there is also in the website that we published on surveillance studies, you can find their email. Sure, you can contact them, Jenna and Kate. Thank you, that was great. And I see that Rosamunde has a question. If you could expand a bit more about the ideas of Googlar and Neyland on mundane governance related to your research.
This is a great question because we're actually working through this right now. So we'd love thoughts on this. So we were actually, and this is totally off the cuff actually, because we've used their work in other spaces to really think through like destabilizing the presumptions of relationships between human and non-human actors, and really highlighting, they give some really important strategies for understanding how technologies that are seen as silent still enact agencies and power in everyday life. And that even when you're doing qualitative interviews with folks, they may not always recognize that. So there's other strategies for trying to elicit it. And so one of the things that we found productive about using their framework was, one, the reminder of, because these are actions that regulate in everyday life, even though we don't recognize it, that means we can generate forms of accountability back. And so our school is dedicated to the study of regulation and governance. Our big underlying goal is to reduce domination in the world, but we have no frameworks for thinking through the forms of domination that come through, corporatized technologies that permeate everyday life. And so Wolgar and Nayland were productive in terms of helping us think through those dynamics. I am hoping we can kind of push their ideas a little bit farther than that, but I have to admit we're still working through that. And Jenna, I don't know if you have other thoughts about how they've been informative in terms of your work.
Yeah, definitely. I think that mundane governance really comes through in the more localized relationships and how different residents and local actors try to govern each other, not just through technology, but in these broader ecosystems in which technology is involved. So, for instance, how they try to regulate or perhaps I'll provide an example. So in order to go to certain WFP, UNHCR sites to, let's say, receive a banking card or get their iris scanned, or to go to a banking site to receive cash, they will essentially work together in ways to get to that site in a more cost-effective manner. So they'll carpool, or they will look at different public transportation routes together. But of course, this ends up including some people in these types of more localized relationships rather than others. And this is something that happens on the ground as opposed to at a more governmental level or a policing level or a more formal level. Like, these are very informal relationships that are happening every day in ways that they try to negotiate. But they do also reveal these types of hierarchies in and of themselves, and like hierarchies of governance, I guess I would call them, that are at this more mundane level. So you would have a community leader who is essentially disseminating this type of information, and a lot of the I would say the more rural towns and villages would have this type of community leader who is enacting this type of mundane governance and sort of getting people to come together to do this type of work together to get to banking sites or wherever. But it is something that I'm also working through in my research, and I'd have to think about it a bit more, but yeah.
And Jenna, just thinking about what you said and the examples from some of your research, just how technology enacts what possibilities can happen on the ground. And some of the participants don't even realize that because they're so preoccupied with engaging the technology, they don't realize how the technology is shaping what can and can't happen. Sometimes they have very deep reflections on how it happens, but at other times, there's nothing. We saw the same thing in India when certain systems didn't align and people didn't realize it until there was a major glitch. Or, for example, in India, we found that transgender colleagues were just completely erased from the system because in one system, they were recognized as transgender, in another, they only had binary codes, and no one caught that until someone started raising issues. And so there was a whole massive form of governance that was happening that no one realized until that, moment, that breakage became visible.
And that's definitely coming through in the Lebanese case with the targeting algorithm, in which swaths of refugees are calling UN-held hotlines to complain about being excluded from assistance, even though they are deeply vulnerable and, they filled out the paperwork correctly and they did what they were supposed to, but they were still excluded from the targeting algorithm. That is certainly coming through. And a lot of them also complaining that it's not really being taken into consideration how much prejudice they're experiencing and how that actually makes it really difficult to go through a lot of these processes or procedures that are required in order to access digitized welfare.
Yeah, but a great question.
Thank you very much. Anybody has any more questions? We have still 20 minutes left. Yes, Bram, go ahead.
Hi, both. Once again, thanks for the wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. Nice to see some empirical research and results as well. It was very enlightening. I was wondering about whether in the research project you foresee any direct policy implications, or let's frame it differently, any suggestions for improving the whole system, or how do you think about these kind of things? Thanks.
Jenna, I might defer to you because I know you're wrestling with this part right now.
I am. I think that's a great question, Bram. It's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about disseminating. I did tell all of my participants that I'll be providing them a summary of my findings, and I'm hoping that at the end of the day, hopefully this could at least be used to inform some sort of policy shift or inform at least policy deliberations. But it's so clear that they are working in these incredibly deteriorating, complex, constantly changing, underfunded systems and contexts. And so the decisions that they're making are heavily constrained. It's not just someone making a poor decision or someone trying to be intentionally malicious. It's just that they're heavily confined by all these different factors and just a really difficult context to work in. And so I am a little bit hesitant about suggesting any type of policy changes, because I would always end my interviews with a sort of rhetorical question that really let participants go on this type of tangent, just saying, in an ideal world, what would you be shifting about the social assistance or humanitarian system? And they would all basically start off by saying, well, we know this is never going to change because X, Y, and Z, or this is not going to change until the government reforms or until the UN system completely overhauls. And so it makes policy change really, really difficult. But I think the number one policy thing that I would suggest, and it is, I would say, in the moment, sort of the ball has started to roll, is the donors have set up a monitoring agency of the World Food Program called Chameleon. It's this incredibly long acronym, but it focuses on monitoring, evaluation, assessment, and learning outcomes that focus on the World Food Program's projects, including their digitized cash assistance. And already what we see from that group is they go into the informal tented settlements with refugees, and they're talking to them on the ground, and they're talking to the shopkeepers, and they're talking to local residents, and they're getting this grounded empirical research about how digitized cash assistance is rolling out. And then they disseminate these findings not only to the donors and to the WFP so that they can change their operations and improve them, but they're also publicly disseminating them, which I think provides this additional level of accountability and perhaps what we could actually call mundane governance. And so I think that that's a big policy shift that's already being undertaken. It's just taking an incredibly long time. And of course, it's very labor intensive, but I do see hope in that taking place. And I think it's incredibly important in this context, especially given that the Lebanese government is, of course, under-regulated, and the whole Lebanese humanitarian sector in and of itself has had a lot of trouble with harmonizing regulations. So I think Chameleon is a great step in the right direction.
Okay, great. Many thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we still have like 15, 20 minutes. I wonder if anybody else wants to ask Kate and Jenna, now that we have them here, about their research. In any case, well, I could ask many questions, because I mean, your research is so extensive that I'm sure you can give a lot of more insights into, I don't see any hands, into what is the reality of these systems. Like, as you said, on the one hand, the NGOs, they are trying to sort of follow certain policies and privacy policies, data protection policies that make that help refugees or people in these critical situations because they are needed because we don't want data to be floating everywhere around. On the other side, the necessity and the quick necessity, I will say, of these systems to work is like reduces, sometimes how to balance the importance of privacy and the importance of the aid that we need to provide. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about it, and if you could perhaps explain some examples that you can think of this issue and how to balance, or perhaps it's something related to what Bram says. What is the answers of this? Because of course there is no answer. It's extremely difficult and how to balance this, but perhaps you can tell me what are you thinking at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, of course, privacy is incredibly important in any context, especially a context like Lebanon, in which you have some of the world's most vulnerable populations having their data collected, extracted, used, and stored. And refugees are even emphasizing this, both the ones that I spoke to on the ground, but also tons that have been mentioned and consulted in public reports and academic literature that, they also believe that privacy is incredibly important. And I'm not saying that data protection protocols are useless or that they shouldn't be implemented. They of course should, and it is a huge step in the humanitarian sector. And, we see documents like the ICRC releasing data protection handbooks, as the UNHCR is releasing guidance on how to use beneficiary data. And so this is really important. But what also became very, very clear in my research, and I'm still sort of wrestling with how to frame this, is so many of the practitioners emphasized how rituals of regulation were unnecessarily cumbersome. So yes, they serve a purpose, but they ended up stifling aid that should have been delivered immediately or in a certain way or to certain groups, because these regulations actually prevented effective aid distribution. And they would talk about things about how someone made this example of like how they're like, you spend $20 to purchase something, and then you have this whole list of paperwork and regulation that you have to go through in order to get it approved for the system. And then another thing is with the humanitarian system, especially with digitized aid and in a context in which funding is incredibly limited. And so there's this emphasis upon using what you have the most efficiently. They tried to implement something that they called the deduplication system, in which beneficiary data it was logged in this harmonized system that was supposed to pick out the fraudulent cases who are applying for assistance with more than one agency. And this is a highly regulatory platform because it not only regulated the beneficiaries seeking assistance themselves, it also regulated the agencies. And so they had to report all of their work through this system and through an adjacent system called RAISE, the Refugee Assistance. I can't remember the rest, RAIS. But what they were finding was that the deduplication system and these reporting platforms were taking so much time. They weren't explained how to properly use them. They had more than one reporting platform or web platform for the same type of assistance, and it was just becoming incredibly confusing. And it was then requiring extra meetings, which is then taking more time away from their incredibly important emergency work. And so they said that in a lot of ways, regulation and coordination, although incredibly, incredibly important, was also really, I don't know how to frame it, like was overly burdensome and unnecessary at times. And so I think we need to find more ways in which types of regulation and types of digital platforms are actually consulted first with the local practitioners and the ones who are actually going to be inputting this data before setting them letting them loose. And then even in the case of the deduplication system, a lot of them emphasized how the deduplication system was released way too late in the program. And then that added a whole ton of work, and then also meant that the refugees or beneficiaries who were supposed to receive assistance didn't. And again, it was just a case of it's being decided, designed, and implemented at this higher level in these transnational agencies. But then the ones that are on the ground, in the field, in the nation, who are having to input this data, collect this data, and use the data, are finding that it just simply doesn't match up with what they need to do and what's actually best in the local context. Sorry, that was a lot of a ramble.
No, this is great. Thank you so much. I do agree that we need some sort of homogenization. I don't know how to pronounce this word. We need the more structure and simplification. And I mean, we're seeing it also in other parts, like now with new regulations coming up, we need to simplify this because you mentioned biometric identification as well. This will have more implications with new regulations coming up. And now you are already explaining how sometimes difficult and burdensome it is for these organizations to, well, to be lawful and to well, we hopefully they will listen into these issues that are extremely important. And I just want to ask Bram, because I don't know if we need to finish now at 10:40, or do we have some more time? I think Bram is typing.
Yeah, we can close off early if there's no more questions. But I see still a question from Sven in the chat for a link to the Chameleon organization that Jenna mentioned, or some more information about that organization.
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't see that. Yes. So we have. I still didn't see the question.
Jen, are you typing?
I'm actually just finding the link to put into the chat right now.
No worries. I mean, just to pick up maybe what you were saying while we wait on that response, Jenna, I mean, the question about regulation is really interesting because so much of us talk about the space as being unregulated when, you know, so many other powerful actors are actually setting the terms of regulation. So it's amazing that we have government regulation coming into the space, but it inevitably has to deal with the power asymmetries that have already, you know, been created on the ground. And you know, sites of procurement are actually probably really important spaces that we don't even recognize as regulation because we've prioritized certain kinds of formal regulation because it's absolutely needed, but we may not be thinking through the plurality of regulation that's needed in this space. But it's early days. I mean, these are still early discussions in related digitized spaces.
I actually think that's better than I could have explained it. So
Don't say that.
No, I think it is, of course, there are, of course, a lot of implications that we cannot, you know, start to even explain properly here in the few minutes that we have left. I just, I wonder if somebody else wants to have the last questions, otherwise I can talk forever and ask myself another question. No? So I think, well, the main questions that I have, I've already asked. And above all, for me, it was to me, it was very interesting, the examples that you mentioned of the electronic banking and the CCTV cameras with the ATM monitoring. And I was wondering if with this type of technologies that they are, well, I mean, they are introducing them, of course, as help. Have you come across any let's say, issues that like really important problems that because of this sort of monitoring, even with the electronic banking, I'm thinking about this credit scores and perhaps, I know you mentioned a little bit that, but if you could expand on it about, for example, if some we were sorry to go back to these feminist examples, but perhaps because a woman was seen alone in the street, yeah, this ATM monitoring can help in a way, but also can have like serious issues and implications for these people, not always as positive as, you know, this kind of rhetoric. And you mentioned the digital welfare state and this humanitarian aids as something good, but they can also have problems. Perhaps you could think about some example.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ATM monitoring is essentially what they do is they have a few NGO personnel stand there with vests, and they essentially just organize people, and they make comments to, you know, step back, stand this far apart, that type of thing. So there's people like physically standing there watching the banking site with the ATM and the long queue of people. So it's really important because what happened with all the currency shortages in Lebanon that are going on with the financial crisis is they would release the payments to the cards on a particular day, and then everyone would go to the ATM to get their cash because they worried, you know, if I'm there late, someone else is going to take all the cash that's in the ATM, and so I have to get there first. And this creates like a lot of tension and anxiety, and it's really difficult for those recipients who are trying to receive their cash. Like it becomes very conflictual. And this has been reported as particularly difficult, but also dangerous for women who are lining up, especially because we need to consider that a lot of these female-headed households, they are having to bring their children along with them. And when you look at the videos of just a regular ATM, it's already incredibly crowded, but the ones where refugees are able to go and withdraw their cash are like, it's swaths of people. It is crowds of people, and they're pushing, and it's a lot of like high energy and anxiety, which is very, very dangerous for not just women, but also those with disabilities and the elderly as well. And so we need to also think about these other groups who are having a lot of difficulties with banking sites. And so ATM monitoring is, of course, really important because they can try to make a more, let's say, organized line of people. But something that the NGO personnel emphasized to me was, oh, but we actually can't do anything. So what happens is, let's say a fight does break out, all they can do is report it to local authorities. They can't actually go and physically intervene and break the people apart. That's simply not their job. So of course, this is working within the confines of what they can and cannot do, and it could create more harm at the end of the day if they do directly intervene in these types of conflicts. But is it really helping at the end of the day? We're not entirely sure. And then if we're actually thinking about, let's say we're playing along their logics of like the bottom line. So how much capital is it taking to do this type of procedure? The NGO personnel are having to go to the banking sites themselves using their own cars. And we know that fuel prices are skyrocketing and fuel is incredibly limited in the country. So they're actually having to pull their own resources. So then the INGO is trying to carpool to get everyone to go using their own resources, or in some cases, they're using taxis to get all of the NGO personnel to the banking site. And then this cuts, you know, funding that they need to do other types of operations. So not entirely sure how effective it is, but again, what they're having to do in Lebanon is essentially just adapt. They're having to have these creative solutions that they've never had to implement before because the context is so new and so unique and constantly changing. But yeah, that's an example that comes off the top of my head.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna wrap up because I see that well, there is we could continue asking questions, but I see that nobody has the hand raised now. So I was wondering if Kate would like to say a few last words, or Jenna.
Gosh, I don't know what else to say. I mean, maybe I'll give a little, maybe I'll give a little plug for thinking through regulation in different ways. Just because I am the director of the School of Regulation and Global Governance, I feel like it's my job. But I mean, what Jenna, I really appreciate about what you highlighted in your work is that we can think about regulation not simply as a government regulatory intervention, and like the plurality of what's going on. And you know, while I was, you know, trained in surveillance studies, really appreciate it. It was really regulatory studies that helped me think through, like, what are the networks of governance happening? How do we think critically? You know, we have lots of debates about privacy, and people have developed really nuanced ideas around privacy, but looking at the scale of what we're dealing with, and absolutely the corporatized power that's operating in this case and as well as others, having more nuanced vocabulary and set of tools to think through regulation, I think is just absolutely essential. So maybe that would be my little plug to conclude, that if anyone's interested in that space, we are more than happy to have more questions about regulation, since it's not necessarily a sexy or hot topic, but we think it's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great as a conclusion. And Jenna, would you like to say a few last words?
I really just want to thank you all for having us here. It's always lovely to talk about our research. And I think it's really important to, as Kate mentioned, sort of think through that nexus of surveillance and regulation, not as entirely distinct, but as perhaps forces that co-occur together, but also in distinct ways. I think we can get some really interesting insights when we do think through that nexus alongside grounded empirical work. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I think, Bram, would you, I see that you're typing. I don't know if you would like to say something. Thank you. Everyone is thanking you. So, on behalf of everyone that has their cameras turned off, I would say thank you to you. I really enjoy the talk. I have a lot of insights now, so thank you. It was great. The job that you're doing is extremely interesting and important, and in critical situations, and it has to be, it's a serious and hard job. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope that if you need, if everyone on the audience need to contact them, you can email Kate and Jenna, and otherwise we'll hope to have you at VUB in Brussels someday soon. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for having us. It was great to chat.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.